Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me for part 2 of this conversation. This is part 2 of our conversation with Steven Fuller. If you haven't listened to part 1, you'll definitely want to go back and do that first. The link is in the description, or you can easily find that by searching Stories Lived, Stories Told for our first episode with Steven Fuller. As always, my name is Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and here's my question for today. What is keeping us from really getting to know people? I want to use this question to frame today's conversation because this is a big theme in Steven's life that he shares about with us today. I think this is a good question to think about for ourselves in our individual interpersonal relationships, and then also to kind of zoom out and look at our role in a larger society and a larger culture. What is keeping us as a culture from really getting to know the members of our society and really having the capacity to hold space for the differences that we'll learn about as we get to know people? And maybe part 2 of that question, what's keeping us from getting to know people is what do we need to be doing? What do we need to be practicing? What do we need to be cultivating in order to really start to get to know people? So today, as I said, is part 2 of our conversation with Steven. We're going to talk more about community. We're going to talk about his book, The Church Experiments. So with our framing question in mind, remembering part 1 of this conversation, let's jump back in with Steven. I kind of want to move on to kind of a, part 2 of our conversation and get into some of the cool things that I know that you've done, the podcast. And I'd love to talk about you writing The Church Experiment and also your game, Good versus Gooder. Would you be especially excited to talk about any one of those first?
Yeah, let's talk about The Church Experiment. I think because it's probably a good segue from some of the stuff we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of mentioned previously that as a kid, I was this curious person and I was trying to figure out how the world worked and why people were the way that they were. And, I mentioned the Santa Claus example of trying to figure out, is Santa Claus real, and then relationships. And one of the areas that in my 20s that started to really fascinate me was religion and God specifically. So I have this really sort of bizarre journey with religion that, as a kid, we really weren't anything. I mean, sort of, I think the way a lot of people grow up is you go to church for Easter and Christmas and you sort of vaguely believe in some sort of a God, however you define that. I would have said I believed in God as a teenager or kid or whatever, but I wouldn't have really known what that meant or done anything practically that would have shown that in any way. So when I was in college, I met this professor who was a Christian and was part of a student group on campus. And his whole kind of thing was he would have conversations with people and talk about spirituality. And when I was younger, I wasn't like a bad person or, I was in the sense that we're all probably bad people in some ways, but I was a pretty decent human being. But I also felt like life is messy and people are messy and my relationships are messy. And so he and I hung out and had conversations. And from those conversations, at one point, I decided I'm going to give this Christianity thing a chance. And so I did. And that was a wild experience where because of who I am, like the perfectionism,
mm-hmm.
and I can talk a pretty good game. I'm a pretty good public speaker. Like I went from not having any religious background to suddenly I was like working at a church. I was like leading these Christian groups. And I don't even know the whole time if I believed much of any of it. I was just sort of trying to figure stuff out, but you learn how to play the game really quickly and say all the right things and do all the right things. And so I eventually was like an assistant pastor at this church startup. And again, just this whirlwind within like 10 years, going from, I don't really have a background in this to I'm suddenly like part of church leadership.
Mm.
But I think at the whole time, regardless of kind of how it all played out, at the heart of that was me trying to figure out like, what is life? Why are we here? How do we get here? Like, what do we do? What are we supposed to do?
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's a big mystery there, obviously, that I'm certainly not the first one to point that out of
Right.
like, what is this universe and how the heck are we even having this conversation right now? And it was my journey to figure that out. And towards the end of that journey, I just kind of realized that I think all of this is really complicated. And I'm not sure what I'm doing in this church environment. I don't know if I believe any of this. I think a lot of these people in this environment don't know what they're doing and are kind of playing a game. It didn't mean they were bad people. It just mean, just like me, we were just sort of trying to figure it all out. And so when I decided to leave the church, over that next 6-7 months, I still had this question of like, what did I just experience for 10 years? Like, I know some really good people who do this church thing. I know some really bad people that do this church thing.
Yeah.
How does that happen? One of the big mysteries at the time that I thought about quite a bit was driving on 71 North, 71 or 75, I can't remember. There's that church up there that had the touchdown Jesus statue. I don't know if you're familiar with this.
Yeah.
Some comedian wrote a song about it one time, but there was this church and they had this massive statue out front of Jesus, like with his hands up in the air, and everyone called it Touchdown Jesus. And I would drive by it as I would go visit friends that were living farther north. And every time I drove by, I just looked at it and I thought to myself, like, what's going on in that church? Like, why did they make that giant statue? Like, what about them made them think, oh, this would be a good idea? And so I just kept thinking, like, well, I should just go in there. Like, I should just go to church there and go to a service and see what it's all about. And so I mean, this has been, a long time now, but I just decided, okay, I'm going to go to church there. So I went in. It was early January. It was like the first Sunday in January. It was like a New Year's resolution thing. So I went to church there, and it is what it was. It wasn't my style of church. The people were nice. Some of the things the pastor said seemed weird to me. It was an interesting experience. And from that experience, I was like, what if I just did this every week all year? What if I just picked a different, and at the time, my language was off. I called it the church experiment, which church is a very specific type of religious gathering. But what if I just went to a bunch of different places that were Catholic and Christian and Methodist, but then also, Jewish and Muslim and, Buddhist. And I went to the Church of Scientology, and I went to an atheist meeting. Every week for 52 weeks, I just went to a different religious gathering just because I was curious and I was trying to figure out, like, who are these people and why are they here and what do they want from this experience? And so that's what I did. And at the time I blogged about it. And so every week I would just kind of go back home and write up what my experience was like. If it would have been now, I probably would have done a podcast about it. But
yeah, right.
Back then blogging was the thing.
Yeah.
And so, the first few weeks, it's like it got a little bit of a following, and then it got a little bit more and a little bit more. And suddenly there were, thousands of people reading it and commenting on it. And then at the end of it, I just decided I was going to put it all together in a book. So people had one sort of thing that they could go to read it. But yeah, it was just the same old thing for me. It was me being curious about something and wanting to know more about it and wanting to solve the mystery of God and religion and purpose and all of that stuff.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I'm curious too, because 2009, I think was your church experiment. So you actually did it 14 years ago. You wrote the book years after that. And you had that reflection at the very end of your book to say, okay, as I'm writing this, here's where I'm at now. I'm curious if you wrote a conclusion to that conclusion now, talking about it, if anything's changed or what it's like to look back on that experiment now and what reflections you have that you maybe didn't have then.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. My journey that I took was certainly interesting. The whole experience was so interesting because so there's a lot of that happened during the experience. So, like the Church of Scientology experience was just very fascinating to me. People have lots of thoughts about the Church of Scientology. It was definitely one of the more unique experiences I had. I had another church where the pastor of the church found my blog and I was critical about the church. And so he kind of said these really mean things about me and in the comments, and we had this back and forth. And so there would be things like that would happen. But at the end of the day, I try to separate, which I try to do this in all areas of my life, the human beings from the systems. Mm-hmm. That gets really tricky, right? Because again, almost every place I went, the human beings were pretty similar. They were just nice people, said hello, were friendly. They were just people. But I had so many issues with the systems and some of the messaging and the types of churches that I would go to. There would be all kinds of different experiences. Like there was one church that was the one where they would call people up front and then like lay hands on them and pray, and people would fall over and kind of like flop around on the ground. And so that pastor knew that I was there doing this. And so he called me up front to pray for me. And I was sweating and I was like, oh my gosh, I do not want to do this. But I went up front and he was praying for me. And so two things happened during that, which I still try to wrap my brain around to this day. Number one is while he was doing it, I felt something. Like there was this feeling, there was this like tingling, I felt something that to this day, psychologically, I still don't know how to explain it. Secondly, when he gave like the little push at the end, I fell back on purpose. Like I knew what I was doing. Mm-hmm. Like I didn't lose my balance and fall. Like I consciously made that choice because I know that's what they wanted. Like that was the game that was being played. And so there's this part of me that in looking back on all of it still kind of wrestles with like, there's some mystery out there. And I don't claim to be smart enough to know the mysteries of the universe, and no one ever will. But I still saw the game. Mm-hmm. Like I still was in the middle of the game being played where I stumble back and fall because this is what they want you to do. And so I don't know how to explain what people experience when they're up there. Like, is there some part of that that's real? Do they know what people are expecting of them? So they kind of go along with it. Mm. And so when I think about that whole experience, I think a lot about those two ends of the spectrum. And for everything in my life with religion or whatever it is, it's trying to sift through all of the data to figure out what's real and what's fake here. Mm. And so a lot's happened since then. And again, I don't want to, now that we've talked about religion, let's talk about politics. So I think the reflection I wrote was in like 2017 or something. I'm trying to think of the exact time. Mm-hmm. It was right after Trump had been elected. Yeah. Some of my reflection at that time was in response to seeing evangelicals react to Donald Trump and how disappointed I was in seeing how intertwined religion and politics had become at the time. And I could not wrap my brain around how I'm speaking very slowly here. You can tell, to make sure I choose
Thoughtfully. It's good.
every
Yeah.
word perfectly. I couldn't wrap my brain around how people who were part of a faith that I had been a part of for a long time and felt like I had a decent understanding of what it meant to be a part of this faith could look to that particular human being as being some sort of representative of that faith.
Yeah.
I was very confused. I'm still very confused by it. And so when I wrote that reflection, it was a lot of that was in response to that and some sadness and confusion and disgust. And now I look back a few years later and boy, I'm really probably more confused than ever.
Yeah.
With how the Christian faith have tied themselves to that particular human being. And like I've spent a lot of time processing my church experiment, my involvement with religion. And so when I think a lot about that experiment now, it's trying to answer that same old question, but trying to answer it in this slightly different way. Like, how did this happen? And again, it all circles back to, for me, communication and what I do. It's trying to understand people.
Yeah, I really commend you for being guided by curiosity and mystery throughout that whole process, even just in the very first idea of what if I did this? Because I think, you even, wrote in your book, you didn't do a lot of research ahead of time. You just went in and had the experience. And I think it's easy for people to write off others who are different from them by, Googling or going off of what they think that they know, but just being, kind of profoundly open to it in the way that you were, I think is a real, skill almost that a lot of people aren't open to cultivating in themselves because it feels easier to maybe not lean into the complexity of all of these relationships. But I also want to say, just in terms of the stories that we tell in our lives and about religion or spirituality, I think more of the stories that have persisted are stories of certainty and no question asking, and this is how it is, and this is what we believe, and this is why, or this has been my experience, and I'm certain, and I know these things because of these other things. But my favorite stories are the ones where people are like, I have no idea, and that's okay. And I think that's what we need to hear more of. And I feel like, to me, your book was a little bit of that. By the end, you were like, I don't know, and I have peace about that. To me, that's the goal for me, of, like you're saying, that life, the world, God, the universe is one big mystery, and we're not equipped to solve it. And so the question isn't how do we solve this mystery? It's how do we find peace with living in the mystery? Which is hard, right? Because as a control freak perfectionist, the last thing I want to do is to not be able to figure something out. And that's, for me, every time this cycle comes up, right, of whatever it is, it becomes an obsession that I think isn't healthy for me, right? But that never ending quest to try to figure it out, I think, is a really healthy pursuit, but it can also be really challenging, right? When sometimes there are no answers. It's like, why did my ex cheat on me? And you can spend the rest of your life trying to figure that out. And sometimes it's just, there's no explanation. Yeah. People just do dumb stuff, or maybe the explanation is really, really deep in their psyche that you're never going to be able to get to. Yeah. And maybe they will someday if they go through all of that work. But, I find myself at my happiest when I'm able to let go of the desire to control and know everything. But then also, it's part of why I like my job, is that's also a fun quest to be on. And so I think there's a balance there of, I like mystery and I like being able to figure it out. And then I also have to be mature enough to know when to let go a little bit. I've come to terms that I'm not going to know how the universe started, or if there's some higher power. A lot of religion is about faith, and I'm just like, well, I'm not good at that. Like, I need Yeah.
I need some proof. I need some evidence. I need a recording of Santa Claus, right? Like I need a
Yes.
letter
Yeah.
showing that he's real or not.
Yeah.
And just faith is wonderful for people that have it, but I need to dig deeper, and I like digging deeper, but you can't dig so deep that you can't find your way back out of the hole, and so I think that's a balance that you learn a little bit later in life. But again, it's like I keep trying to come back over and over again from the thing that in my own life that I feel like I learned from that is like, if we really get to know people, like if we really try to get rid of stereotypes and things that we see on cable news and the narratives, the stories that other people want you to believe about the world, and you do some of the investigative work yourself. The church experiment is kind of a unscientific version of an ethnography.
Yeah.
Which, if people aren't familiar with, it's where you almost go undercover in its most intense form and become part of a community in order to learn about that community. And so, yeah, you can read a book about, Catholicism, or you can go to a Catholic church and sort of become part of that community. And I always was a bit obsessed with ethnographies. Like, you get to experience all of these different worlds and people, and not just like go hang out with them, but what's it actually like to be this person and to live in this world? The more that you can put yourself in other people's worlds, the whole thing of walking a mile in their shoes, it's like, it's really true. It's like, it's one thing to just assume, and it's another to get that firsthand experience. And if you aren't around people, if you don't get to know actual human beings, your whole life becomes about believing these stereotypes that people in positions of power who get rich off of you believing those stereotypes want you to believe. And when you actually get to know people, when you actually meet real human beings and understand their stories and their experiences, 99.99% of the time you walk away thinking, oh, you're pretty much like me. Like, you might have had a different experience. You've faced some things that I haven't faced. You've had to deal with oppression in ways that I haven't had to deal with all of my privilege. But at our core, we want to be happy. We want people to love. We want to be loved. We want to have meaningful careers. We want to be safe. Like, all of those same core goals are there because we're all just people. Actual human beings generally want the same things. And if we can get more of that and spend less time watching cable news and scrolling our phones, reading all of the hateful rhetoric, I think we might have a chance. And if not, I think we're kind of in trouble.
On the idea of people being in relationship with people, what I'm curious about, and is my lingering question from your book, is that what you really ended on was this idea of community, which is also what our conversation started with. So this is a nice full circle. And I just really related to that because my story mirrors yours in some ways and differs in others, but I did grow up in a Christian church and had just the best community. And so when I look back, I think it was probably more about that community than about the actual religion for me, of what made that, for me, such a positive experience. But what I really liked that you got to was it's this search for community. And I think I've struggled to find community outside of a church because it is so built in. And I think that is what you wrote about, what a lot of people really look for and need in that community. And so I'm curious now, what other ways do you find community?
Yeah, I mean, that's really challenging. I think the older you get, the more challenging it gets. There's some pretty clear research out there that, generally speaking, we tend to have the most friends in our teens and early 20 years when we're in high school and college. And then those friendships go down as you age. And by the time you get to like your late 20s, early 30s, you often have the least amount of friends you'll have in your lifespan. And then they tend to go back up a little bit as you get into your later 30s and 40s, as you have children, and then your children meet other children, and then you become friends with those kids' parents and coach sports and on and on. And I personally don't have kids. And so as I age, what I'm finding is the search for community, people would do almost anything to get that.
But people are desperate for connection in that way.
Yeah, I think it starts to explain why so many communities often feel cultish.
Yeah.
I've always kind of been obsessed with cults, and, similar to kind of the ethnography thing. Like I really, at some point, would have loved to kind of go like undercover in a cult and just like live in a cult for a while. Because that whole concept fascinates me, that people, and there's a lot of psychology there too of, people get into these environments and they do all these really bizarre things. And then when the cult leader is found to be a fraud, they don't just immediately be like, oh boy, that was silly, I guess I'm going to go back to my life. It's like
they double down on. Yeah.
And the psychology behind that makes a lot of sense to me, right? Because your head would explode if you came to terms with the fact that you just spent your life in a cult for, a year or 2 years, whatever. And so it doesn't surprise me at all when political figures are found out to be criminals, or when we have attacks on the Capitol or whatever it is. And instead of people being like, oh boy, that was weird, they just double down and become even more entrenched in those views. And so for me, when I think about community, it's like, well, of course, people go to church, and even if they don't believe what people are saying or whatever it is, you finally have friends and community in a place that is yours and ownership over that. Again, it's not to judge people. I mean, I think all of us do things that would surprise ourselves if we had perspective of what we're willing to do to be around people and have friends and feel like we belong somewhere. And again, you could give 1,000 examples. I mean, I'm a big sports fan. Like the things that I teach a class on communication and sport, and we talk about sports fandom, and the things that sports fans do are, I mean, people paint their bodies and people dress up like stormtroopers and go to games, and like, what? Like, this is all bizarre behavior. And, even on social media, right? As people develop these entire personalities in order to get followers, and that's a sense of community. And, I try not to judge people, but I certainly understand at this stage of my life how difficult it is to find people and community, and you have to kind of go out of your way. And so it makes sense that someone would go to a church. It makes sense that someone would be part of a sports organization, whether they're playing or as a fan. And most research I've seen recently is pretty clear that longevity, the primary way that you live a long, healthy life, is through your relationships with other people.
Yeah.
That certainly, exercise and eating and sleep and all that stuff matters. But the one factor they've seen show up over and over again is the amount and the quality of your relationships. And that's scary, right? Because people hear that and they're like, well, I don't have any friends and I don't have any community. So what am I supposed to do here? And so we're desperate, right? We're desperate to find people that we can connect with. And so I certainly have empathy and compassion for people that end up in situations that maybe they're not happy with or proud of, but it's the way that they get that sense of community. I don't know if I'm going to be heading back to church anytime soon, but I certainly understand that for a vast majority of people, it's probably primarily about community.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're in a community, right, you have to sort of have a shared set of values and beliefs and rituals. And sometimes you end up doing things that maybe you don't necessarily agree with or believe or whatever, but go along with it to fit in. And next thing you know, you're like, how did I get here? How did I become this person? And that's really hard to get out of.
Yeah. I would love if you could share with us how you would define a better social world and what you think are things that we could all be doing now to start working in that direction.
Yeah. So I knew you were going to ask this question. So I was thinking about it a little bit. And so there's kind of the duality of Steve is I'm a realist. So I'm not an optimist for sure. I also think I'm not a cynic. Some people would call me a cynic, but I don't think I'm a cynic. I think I'm a realist. And so there's two ways I would answer this question. So I'm going to start with the bad way to try to end on a good note. The bad way is I am really concerned right now about our world. And so when I think about creating a better social world, there is a part of me that feels like we have lost. That yes, I heard people talk about, and I understand the perspective of, if you go back through history, right? Like we fought a civil war in this country. Like there certainly are times throughout history where things have been worse and all of that. I get that. But it's also felt like throughout history that we've been moving in a certain direction that's felt like progress, right? That if you go back and look, it's like, okay, yeah, it was terrible. And then it got a little less terrible, and a little less terrible. And it felt like we were moving in that direction for a pretty long time. And there's a part of me that over the last 5 to 10 years has just seen that progress feel like it's stopped, and in some ways it started to go the other direction. And, I mentioned politics earlier. It felt like the last 4 or 5 years have been such a battle, kind of internally and externally, that I feel exhausted. And I've grown up in privilege my whole life. Like I'm exhausted, and I have had so much handed to me through over the course of my lifetime that I can't even begin to imagine how exhausting the world feels for people that haven't grown up in that privilege. And it just feels hopeless. And it feels like anything we say and do doesn't really matter anymore, that you can get on social media and yell at people, and it's just white noise. And at the end of the day, all it does is make you miserable and contribute to the hateful rhetoric that seems like it's tearing our society apart. Okay, but I won't end on that because that seems kind of depressing. So there's a big part of me that feels that way. And so when you ask, like, how do we create a better social world? There's a part of me that's like, you know what? I don't care. I've been trying for a long time, and I'm exhausted, and I've been angry for the last 6 years. And I scroll through social media and I go down these rabbit holes, and I see all these hateful people saying all these hateful things. And it's like eating away at my soul. And I just don't want to spend the rest of my life being miserable. So there's that part of me. But then there's another part of me that I've talked about this for a few years. Like I feel like, and I'm obviously not the first person to say this, you've probably had a lot of people on the podcast bring it up. I feel like the only hope we have is empathy. And I feel like our biggest problem right now in our world is we are having an empathy crisis. That every time people open their mouths, everything they're saying is through their own lenses, that it's all about them. There's a brand of selfishness that has overtaken our society that has caused people to stop looking at the world through other people's lenses. I could give 1,000 of examples of this, but all of the recent social movements, like the Me Too movement, where you have men trying to give their opinions about the Me Too movement, and you're like, can you just stop and look at the world through a woman's eyes for 5 seconds? Well, I don't think men, and it's like, wait, what? You don't know. Like, you're not the one experiencing it. Like, I was talking to my friend who travels a lot for work, and I was like, oh, that's so cool. I would love to travel for work because I like exploring cities, and I would love to go to like the hotel bar and just hang out and talk to people. Like, you're so lucky. And she was like, yeah, but it's not like that for a woman, because you go to a hotel bar and you're like worried about who's going to sit next to you and and I'm like, oh, never really thought about it like that before, because that's what we all do. We all just see everything through our perspective. Yeah. And it's just like with police in the United States, which again, I'm going to hit on all of the controversies. It's like, look, from my perspective, as a white man in America, I've always seen the police as being here for me, to help me, to protect me. And so, yeah, when I think about my experiences of the police, I can think of examples of where I'm driving with expired tags and a cop pulls up next to me and has me roll down my window and says, hey, man, your tags are expired. Make sure you get that taken care of. Or when I'm driving home with a friend of mine who had been drinking a little bit, and a cop pulls us over and says, hey, I smell alcohol in the car. I need to take you out as the driver because I had been drinking too, and takes them over to do a little alcohol test and is like, ah, you're fine. Go home. Like, these are my experiences with the police, but I can't judge police solely on my experiences with them.
Yeah.
Because other people have different experiences. And so how would those 2 traffic stops have gone differently if I were a young Black man versus a middle-aged white guy? Now, I don't know. Other people have had different experiences, so that when they do get pulled over, maybe they're a little bit more anxious. Maybe their first inclination is to run. And then you have middle-aged white people be like, well, just listen to the police. Just do what they tell you. Just comply. And it's like, yeah, I do that, because when I comply, everything goes fine. But maybe they had a friend or a parent or a grandparent who told stories that have shaped their views of the police differently. And so when I look at that situation through my lenses, it looks different than when I look at that situation through someone else's lenses. And so I just think our only hope is if we can somehow figure out how to practice empathy again with other people.
Yeah.
So that when any issue comes up, whether it's transgender rights or the LGBTQ plus community trying to figure out gay marriage or whatever it is, if it's issues of race, if it's issues of immigration, can we just stop? Can we learn how to pause for a couple of minutes and see it through that person's eyes? And if we do, and we're able to empathize and not make everything about ourselves, I think we could potentially create a better social world.
Yeah. Maybe, just maybe.
Yeah. If not, I think we're in big trouble.
Yeah.
And the fear is it feels like we're moving farther and farther away from empathy as it becomes all about us and all about how other people's lives affect me versus just wanting them to have a good life because they're a person too, and they also are deserving of a good life.
Yeah.
And so that's my hope. Like I said, I'm not a cynic, so I don't think it's impossible. I'm not an optimist, so I'm not counting on it to happen.
Yeah.
I'm a realist, and realistically what I see is concerning and disheartening, and it makes me want to withdraw and just give up and be like, I'm just going to go be happy and live my life. And if the world wants to burn, then the world can burn. But there's also a part of the realist in me that still sees human beings one-on-one as being decent people, regardless of any of the things I talked about earlier, right? Whatever religion you are, whatever race you are, whoever you voted for, those one-on-one conversations and one-on-one relationships, to me, it still feels like people are people and we all want the same things and we're all decent deep down. And if we can just figure out how to turn off all the noise and tune into being empathetic human beings, I think we'll be okay.
No, I think I really appreciate that as a very real answer, because it would be nice to sit here and say, let's just empathize with each other. And that's not that hard, and go from there, and A plus B equals C, and we'll have a better social world. But that's, yeah, like you said, maybe not realistic. And I think it's important to acknowledge the general exhaustion that people feel from the working toward the better social world. Maybe this is one of those moments where the control need in us could be put to good use, in a way of, let's embrace, how do we keep leaning into empathy? How do we use that curiosity, that like creativity and imagination to learn to empathize with people and pass that along to other people? And again, the mystery of life, we do not understand it. We do not control it, but it doesn't stop us from connecting with people.
For sure. And it's hard, right? It's
hard. Yeah.
Try to empathize with someone who's blatantly racist. And it's like, well, this isn't a fun activity.
Yeah.
But again, at my core, I try really, really hard. Like you said, the mystery part, right? It's like, if I want to figure this person out, if I need to solve this mystery, I need to try to do this. And I need to see the world through those lenses. And that's the only hope we have, I think.
I agree. Okay, that is all for our conversation with Steven. Thank you for joining us and for being open to these questions and these realities that we explored with Steven today. And I think this conversation was a real practice in how can we acknowledge both the pain and the complexity and the confusion that we feel, the hopelessness that we feel around a lot of the realities of our world. And at the same time, how can we be working towards a better social world and be hoping and be using our imagination to stretch the limits of what we believe to be possible for what we can create for ourselves? As next turns, be keeping in mind the questions that I have written out at the top of the description of this episode, which is, what is keeping us from getting to know people? How can empathy save us? I think those are two good questions to be reflecting on. And of course, if you have any ideas, thoughts, feelings based on this episode or based on anything that you'd like to share, there are a couple ways you can do that. You can contact me on Stories Lived, Stories Told website. You can comment on Instagram or YouTube, or you can email me at storieslived.storiestold@gmail.com. As always, I am supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is one of many initiatives that they support, all with the hope of creating a better social world. And to end on our podcast next turns, please share this episode and, of course, part one as well with someone that you want to bring into the conversation. That's another great thing to reflect on, is how do we keep this dialogue going in our lives? How do we bring more people in? I appreciate you for doing that and taking the time to reflect on that. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this is Stories Lived, Stories Told. Bye.